You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So this is our last episode for Season 4, and I'm excited to say that we've been taken up for a Season 5 and a Season 6, and next year is going to be particularly exciting because we're going to be introducing some new stuff, some new material, which I'm really looking forward to putting out there into the digital atmosphere. So, what are we going to do for the last episode? So, first of all, let me introduce my wife, Lorin, who is, my constant companion, my inspiration, and my risk manager at the moment, given the fact that my brain thinks I can do more with my shoulder than what my shoulder can actually do. So happy to report that this is the second week of post-operative recovery, and I'm feeling pretty good. Minimal pain management. I'm doing my physio. And anyone out there who's either contemplating or is having a reverse shoulder replacement, just go with what the professionals tell you. Don't try to reinvent the book. Don't try to push yourself. So all you guys out there who tend to be that wee bit impatient and a little bit too competitive with yourself and others, pull it back. That shit don't help. Okay, so if you want to make a really good recovery, you'll dot the I's and cross the T's, but don't go through the alphabet. So Lorin and I had a bit of a discussion about what we might want to do with this particular final episode for the season, and I thought what we would do is a little bit of a sort of overview of this last year, because it's been in many respects an interesting year. I mean, we've been putting up with COVID-19 and lockdowns and stuff like that, and in this last year that a lot of that's lifted. Now, interesting little backdrop to that, Lorin and I have managed to get through 3 years worth of COVID or 3 waves, of COVID without contracting the bloody thing. And then out of the blue, we tested positive in the 4th wave. So I'm not sure about Lorin, I can't speak for you, but my ego felt a little dented. It was like I was riding on this wave about, I think I'm immune to this sucker, only to be brutally grounded with the reality that, no, you're not. So it was a slightly humbling experience, which I think is always really useful in life, is to sort of go, you know what, you need to just pull it in a little bit and not get too cocky. What do you think?
Well, yes, I think it's very important to be reminded that we are, like all others, human and therefore vulnerable.
Yes. So this was 3 weeks, about 3 weeks before the surgery. So I'd gone to the doctor to sort of find out, about, my antibiotics and so on. And he suddenly says, "Have you spoken to the surgeon about this?" And I went, "No." And he goes, "Well, you probably should, because they may not want to operate." So in a flash, my well-laid plans for December and January seemed to go up in a puff of smoke. So anyway, got onto the surgeon, and it was the anaesthetist that got back to me and basically said, "Look, if you're asymptomatic, if you're feeling okay," he said, "I'm prepared and happy to go ahead with it." So that's what we did. Because the alternative was like my schedule was just going to get detonated, and that was not going to be a very good thing. So, Lorin, if you look back on this last year, okay, both big picture and little picture, so what do you think are some of the sort of talking points that would be really useful for us to sort of consider? Like, you read a lot, okay? So, I mean, I'll catch you, over breakfast, you're catching up on the news and da-da-da-da. So you've got a fairly good knowledge base here about what you think's relevant for our podcast.
Right. Thank you for throwing me right into the deep end.
That's okay.
We did have a plan.
We're getting to that.
It didn't include me coming up with an overview of the year.
Just a few points.
Look,
don't get caught up in it.
I'm not sure. I've found it very interesting. There's been a lot going on, and it's about where you are in the world, really, isn't it? Mm. I mean, we've got the Northern Hemisphere being hammered by all the consequences of a war going on between Russia and Ukraine. And that's massive. It's massive emotionally for people. Yeah. Not just the poor people who are actually being bombed and killed, but all the people around them and all the history of Russia and its domineering and acquisitional approach to the rest of the world. So that's been really big for everybody. And I think that everybody is really very watchful and very worried about the ongoing effect of that. In fact, I read yesterday in an assessment of what people think are going to happen in 2023. Amongst the various things, I mean, including some people think aliens are going to land, apparently.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. But a large proportion of people all over the world are very concerned about the possibility of nuclear war. Mm. So I think that this has had a massive effect on people's emotional states. Mm. They've come out of a pandemic which... for, I think, just about everyone, I think there's anyone on this planet still alive, probably, who went through the previous pandemic with the Spanish flu. So that was something that was really hard for people to tolerate, to deal with, to learn to adjust to. It had lots of consequences. Here in Australia, it actually had a reinforcing effect on our community, our sense of belongingness and our sense of togetherness. Mm. And that has been very positive. Yeah. But then we morphed into this year where that started to become something that we felt we were managing and coping with, and then we get a war. There's lots of argy-bargy going on between various authoritarian states.
Like China
and the United States is in a mess because of their political issues and...
who would have thought that there'd be an insurrection in the bastion of so-called democracy? I mean, that's
and the
staggering.
Ongoing ramifications of that for them. So, they have an extra layer of stress, that we don't have because we are in a pretty stable sort of place politically. So, yes, it's been a very interesting year, and I think the main points to take away from it are that we need to focus on working together as a species, a planet, and on a planetary level, not hiding away in these old-fashioned ideas of nationalism and, scurrying back into our little caves and fighting off the people outside and looking at each other as if we're strangers. We need to really focus on cooperating. The climate has just been a nightmare everywhere in the world. And so basically we are all looking at significant crises in every country.
So let me throw in a couple other important points to the background of this that is really fundamentally at the core of instability, and that one of them is Brexit. So we got the issue with the UK making probably its dumbest mistake in their history ever, without their government acknowledging the fact that this has been a serious problem. They don't even talk about, the Tories don't even talk about this anymore. So you've got a country that in its economic downfall is experiencing massive social and economic problems at an individual level. I mean, the fact is that with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, energy, sources are drying up. They're challenged. So, people talking about not being able to heat their place because in the privatised, rarefied atmosphere, prices are going up beyond what's sustainable for for most individuals. So, if we can't actually heat and feed ourselves properly, which is one of the things that seems to be, really coming to be an issue, we talk about supply chains, it makes it nice and neutral, then, what's the roll-on effect of this, okay? So one of the things I thought we would do is we would get from the big picture down to the sort of, individual level, and seeing what happened. Now, you and I found a couple of really interesting articles, and so let me just talk about the first one, which this article was written by a woman called Nicole Pressel. Mental health disorders increase amongst preschoolers and teens. And the key points in this article are firstly that mental health disorders in children as young as 18 months have increased since the pandemic began, psychologists say. An Australian Psychological Society survey, of which I'm a member of the Australian Psychological Society, of 1,016 members reported an increase in separation anxiety in under fives. Among 13 to 18-year-olds, 65% saw an increase in depression and half saw a rise in suicidal ideation and self-harm. So the other talking point there is the rise of mental health issues in children in this article could be due to the pandemic, but also natural disasters and global uncertainty, the Society president said. Now, you and I grew up in the Cold War, right?
Right.
So what was one of the key factors in the Cold War globally?
Well, there was always that threat that someone would, either in America or Russia, press that button that would blow the world to bits.
Yep. So
it was there all through our childhood. Yep. Was the discussion, the constant edginess around mutual nuclear destruction. The fact that if someone did hit that button, that it would set off a process that would in fact destroy the planet. And as you know, we both as teenagers, amongst many people we knew, had the kernel of a plan of what we would do if this happened. Yes.
I had identified a sailing boat out in Pittwater that we would hijack because it never went off its moorings, so I figured that the people wouldn't necessarily be that interested.
Yes. We all thought run until, remember, we saw Mad Max and had a look at what humans do in the aftermath of complete disaster and realised we'd be better blown up than living through the nightmare of aggression and cruelty and violence and dominating, subjugating revoltingness that, humans do tend to fall into once all of civilization and its guidance and its mores are taken away from them.
Yeah. So there is a statistic here somewhere. I can't find it right now, but these talking points in this particular article, what were your reactions to this?
Firstly, that diagnosing 18-month-olds is an extremely inappropriate thing for anyone to be doing when it comes to any sort of psychological or emotional issues. They are toddlers. Everything about how they react to the world is centred in their relationships with others.
Yep.
They don't have an understanding of what's going on. They only have an emotional reaction to the emotional reactions of the people around them. The other thing that I saw in this article, which stood out for me absolutely, was not one mention of parents. Not one mention.
Yep.
The word parent is not even in the article.
Yeah. My reaction to that, it's really interesting. One of my favourite frameworks in terms of understanding root causes is Philip Zimbardo's thing about disposition, situation, and systemic. Okay, so where do the problems have its point of origin? Okay, and when I read the article, the first thing that came to mind is that, essentially, what is being diagnosed is purely dispositional. It's not. There's no contextual, understanding in the relationship of the two. It's reductionist fundamentally. And before anybody out there gets a little bit upset or concerned about why we're so adamant about this, I want you to keep in mind that between Lorin and I, we have around 100 years worth of mental health experience. Okay, so don't sneeze at it. So, when I go through the literature and all that, one of the things that often stands out for me is the lack of appreciation of these different levels of impact on the development of both a child to an adolescent to an adult. And I think that this needs to be taken into account when we start, firstly, doing research and secondly, reporting on that research. So when I was reading this for me, diagnosis is about collecting a set of symptoms and understanding what's going on for that particular individual, but I also need to understand the context wherein that exists. And I've been on this bandwagon for a long time. It appears that in the last 35 years, we've been probably 40 years, progressively pathologising what is in fact normal human behaviour. So, one of the outstanding statistics in this particular article that was drawn on was that there was a massive issue about separation anxiety. Now, let me ask you, when you see somebody, whether that's a child, an adolescent or an adult, with a high level of separation anxiety, what are some of the immediate thoughts that you have, Lorin?
Well, my first thought is that there's issues around their attachment.
Absolutely.
That something has gone a little bit haywire in the first couple of years of their lives, in their attachment or bonding, as it used to be called, with their parents.
Yep.
And their primary caregiver. That's the first thing that comes to mind when you have people who express these fears and their anxieties. And that's another thing about this article that I found really very, very, very important, that there was no mention whatsoever of the fact that anxiety is absolutely normal, that we have been through and are going through significant stresses within our society, that individuals' lives have been radically altered and changed due to those stresses, and that's going to impact their emotional states, which is going to impact their children's emotional states. And because we're bonded, and so obviously if children are having separation anxiety, it's something to do with what's going on in the family home, and it's about their attachment and their sense of safety and security.
Yep. So if we then go, okay, let's take the primary sort of proposition in this article, which is this has a lot to do with, the pandemic, natural disasters and global uncertainty. I don't quite get how an 18-month-old kid's going to be necessarily processing that at all.
Well, they're not. They're going to be processing
What's
their
going-
parents' reaction to that.
Exactly.
You know, now the teenagers, yes, they will be processing that, and
Yeah.
it will be frightening, and it should be. That's the whole point. This article fails utterly to recognise that this is normal reactions to what's going on in the
Situations,
world.
yeah.
That this is the situation we are in.
Yeah.
For heaven's sakes, if we didn't experience anxiety, the species would never have survived in the savannah of Africa to move into the rest of the world.
Now, here's the thing that I want to also stress out in this situation. What we need to also talk about in this is the degree of anxiety or distress, right? Now, this article doesn't differentiate at all between stress, psychological distress, and what is a disorder, a psychological disorder, and I think that distinction is fundamentally critical. I mean, if I watch the news and I hear that Putin's about to push the button, I think I'm going to be pretty scared,
Yep.
pretty anxious. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, because part of it is a political game, is irrelevant. Part of that also taps into my experience as a kid growing up in the Cold War.
That's right.
Or as a constant thing. So not to have an emotional reaction, I would question, all right? Now, the mitigating factor. If I have a safe and secure attachment in my relationship of myself and the capacity to emotionally regulate appropriately, what's going to happen is that I'm going to be able to reduce that anxiety to the point where it doesn't impact on my global functioning. Does that make sense?
That's right.
Yeah. And one of the things that I frequently see, and this is one of the things that concerns me when we don't talk about the impact of parents in their relationship on children, is the challenge a lot of parents seem to have about being able to help their kids to learn how to regulate emotions. So now what we're doing is we're outsourcing it to schools, right, to teach children emotional regulation post-7. By that stage, the horse is starting to bolt, actually. You know, the old Jesuit saying of give me the boy, or let's talk about kids before the age of 7, and I'll give you the person, right, I think is highly relevant. That first 7 years, I think, is crucial in children learning processes of individual self-soothing and regulation and then socially appropriate behaviours. Right, and the staggering thing in this, it's all based on this reductionist idea in this article about it's all about the individual. There's nothing situational or contextual, systemic around this. And one of the things that irritates the hell out of me at the moment is the progressive deterioration of social and spatial awareness. And I was particularly the other day when we went shopping consciously aware how people have got their face stuck in their device. And we're not talking about kids. I'm talking about adults who couldn't give a shit about who they bump into. There was one guy walking behind his girlfriend. His girlfriend had her face in her phone and she was about to ram into me. Now I'm in a sling and I'm already, I'm admittedly hypervigilant, and I'm starting, and he looks at me, and we caught our eyes, and he rolled his eyes back about her, and I went, and I just nodded, and he steered her out of the way. Now, on a whole bunch of levels, this is a serious problem. I've had people walk into my car coming out of the driveway because they've got their face in the phone.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, how many times have you seen parents out with their children when they've all got their faces in their phone?
Yeah.
Babies with phones, they're not actually relating to each other.
Yeah.
They're not actually attaching to each other.
Yeah.
And so how can you teach a child about emotions and about how to regulate them and what they're about and why they are normal if you're not actually relating to that child in the first place. I have come across young people, teenagers and adults, over the last few years in large numbers who cannot name their emotions. They don't actually have the words to name their emotions. The failure of their families to teach them about what is an absolutely normal part of being human is just such a problem. And this is why we have this sort of thing. We have this young journalist writing an article about 18-month-olds having stress about COVID, being anxious about COVID. They don't even know COVID exists. They're 18 months old.
What they're experiencing.
What they're experiencing is the family stress, is the anxiety of their parents. And this is the problem, that we are pathologising what are normal human reactions to stress and crisis and fear, and then we are calling them a mental illness, and then we are ascribing them to babies who don't even have an understanding of what's going on around them and therefore cannot possibly be experiencing anxiety because of COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, certainly when I trained as a psychologist in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a deep debate about the idea of mental illness as opposed to psychological disorder. And I wrote a paper at the time where I first started formulating my idea about the notion of stress, distress, psychological distress, and psychological disorder. And there are some mental illnesses, and you work in it,
Absolutely.
have worked. Yeah, absolutely. There's no question that there is something neurological, neurophysiological going on that disturbs a person's mental state, that they don't have any agency or autonomy of.
And that can cause them to experience anxiety.
Exactly.
But anxiety is a normal human response to the situation you are in. It is not a mental illness.
Certainly Lacan would go along with that. I for therapeutic purposes often make a distinction between apprehension and anxiety, and again I'll put it on a scale. So it's natural, like I was apprehensive about the surgery, right? I wasn't anxious, I was apprehensive, right? But I've spoken to people who were about to go into some fairly serious surgery, and they were clearly anxious. They were sleep disturbed. They had muscle contraction syndromes that gave them headaches, sometimes gastrointestinal symptoms. They were having difficulty regulating their respiration and so on. And so there is that sliding up the scale, but I think that the deep concern that I have is psychiatry has become so medicalised that their first port of call is to prescribe medication. Yep. I mean, when you start to think that when, you see even the GP or the psychiatrist, a 7-year-old, and your first port of call is to give them an antidepressant or prescribe an antidepressant, and luckily a lot of people are quite cognizant that, I'm not sure I'm going to do that. I have a serious concern because best practice is psychological intervention prior to pharmacological intervention. But we've, in the practice, have flipped this on the head. Now, partly I think that's a political and economic issue.
I think it's very much located within the bigger picture of our economic and business model that we have ascribed to every factor and every component of our lives. The domination of the idea that the business model is the way to go to run every system that we
Education,
have, including our families by the looks of it, has put us into a position where the approach we take to each other in a individual relationship, within a educational relationship, within a health relationship, So our health practitioners to their clients, our teachers to their students, they have taken on board an idea that there has to be a solution in a medication for any behaviour, any expression of difference. So in a world where we're supposedly embracing difference, we are in fact narrowing.
Yeah, it's become normative.
Narrowing our understanding of what it is to be human, completely ignoring the fact that humans come in very diverse and very different ways, and that's okay. So we have made ourselves very vulnerable to being sold, and I mean literally sold, the idea that a medication will solve every problem. And I have to say, a perfect example of this is the fact that pharmaceutical companies made trillions of dollars over the last 30-odd years, reinforcing the idea that it didn't matter how sick we were, we should still soldier on and go to work, taking their medications so that we could manage, so that we would go out into the community, spreading our germs, spreading our viruses, ensuring that lots more people would have to take those medications. It has been, from a business model perspective, a major win, and it has been, from a societal perspective, a major loss.
It's interesting because that particular ad was present when I was in the public service as a health services manager, and people would come in really ill. Now, to put it in context, I received a report one morning that a couple buildings away they had Legionnaire's disease in the air conditioning, right? And so, immediately started looking at, assessment and audit of our stuff and so on. And people were coming to work with the flu, was really quite sick, and I would send them home. And I remember my boss coming to me and going, I've been made aware that you're sending people home sick. And I said, yeah, well, what's the problem here? And he goes, well, if they think they can work, surely they should be at work. And I go, no. One, we got Legionnaires a couple of blocks up the road. And secondly, they're going to infect everybody else. Just because they think they can work still makes them infectious. And it was like, oh, yeah. It was like, there was this sudden light bulb. And I sat back and I went, what the hell is this about? The idea that you keep going to work until you drop dead and take others with you was a nonsense.
And of course, in the last few years, because of COVID, infection control has been a massive subject. And yet, when the lockdowns here in Australia started being eased and people were going back to work, there were people talking about the fact that their bosses were insisting they came to work even if they felt unwell.
Yes.
They had been so ingrained with this idea that it didn't matter if you were sick, you needed to go to work, that they weren't able to connect the dots of the fact that these people were infectious and that everyone else was being put at risk. So there's been there's been a loss of that understanding of risk management and of infection, and it's hopefully been brought back into our focus over the last few years. But, obviously still some people are missing the point.
Yeah.
Just like this article misses the point that it is normal for people to be reacting to what's happened. Here in Australia, people have been through COVID. They've had their homes flooded 3 and 4 times in 6-month periods.
Yep.
That's after everything around them burnt down in the massive fires.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just sort of inappropriate to think that people aren't going to be feeling stressed and worried.
Yep. Now, having addressed this article, what was really interesting was a couple of days later, in the same publication, the Sydney Morning Herald, was the response, and the response actually came from a psychiatrist. And my reaction was, "Be still my beating heart." There are still some people in psychiatry who are thinking outside the biological dispositional box. So you read that article. So what was your take? What was your take out from that article?
My first thought was, thank goodness this woman was just so on the ball.
Yeah. It was on point, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Common sense exists, at least with this woman.
Yeah.
She was sensible. She was intelligent. Her approach was situationally based. She questioned the need to diagnose our children, teenagers and our toddlers, with mental illnesses, and as she put it, burden them with a diagnosis that they would carry with them throughout their lives. Without looking at the situation they'd been put in and seeing that basically what they were experiencing was normal and to be expected.
Yeah, no, I found that response to the first article really, really encouraging. And if you read the comments to that article, it was overwhelmingly great. There was just gratitude. Yeah, people were grateful for that because, we have a tendency, I think, in the majority of the time, to think a little bit more deeply than what often professionals give credit to the layperson. They don't know necessarily what to do with it, and unfortunately social media and the internet, which has created Dr. Google, leads people astray because a lot of that information is based on the now framework of it's all dispositional. So you get a diagnosis now. There's always disclaimers on it. If you have any doubt, please go and check with the appropriate health professional and so on. But I think that when we look at it in terms of generational educational process, a cognitive bias begins to emerge that gives you a sense of confirmation bias. Okay, so I see this a lot when I work with men who come in to see me with depression. And then when I assess them and I do really go in depth, the majority of them actually the starting point was anxiety. And the majority of them have an attachment disorder. And it's particularly true with any form of addiction. And it doesn't even need to be addiction. Substance abuse of any kind. The person's sedating. What are they sedating? They're sedating their anxiety. Where's the anxiety coming from? Well, a whole bunch of places. If we take a generational look, there's often, one parent has a psychological disorder. It could be their own anxiety disorder or their own personality disorder or both. Now, the temptation in reductionism has been to say, this is genetic. What about the social learning that's behind that? What about the mirroring that goes on in that? So I think, in psychology and psychiatry, there is this sense of if you think purely in a pathological way, you're going to find it. And that's one, and this is where I think our training needs to begin to change. I know that in my training when I was at university and then as an intern and then, studying REBT, systems therapy, all that, family therapy, all that stuff was always oriented to going holistic. Begin to understand the system as a whole. And I don't think we necessarily do that. I don't know a lot of psychologists these days who are very well trained in family therapy or systems therapy or even systems thinking. It's this dispositional thing. We think in this little box. And it's the same problem when we look at gender issues. You know, when I work with boys, they're all trained to look at this little box that's called male, masculine, right? They don't look outside that, and their peer group also tends to do that. So I think there's a two-way process here, you know, possibly even greater, and I don't think, you know, the article on mental health disorders helps that. But a lot of people have an intuition that there's something missing in this.
I think that a lot of people are starting to recognise that the ideas that have been promoted through many of our sort of communication processes, not just journalists or social media, but throughout all of the sort of communication processes that we now have so many of, are in fact quite simplistic, soundbite, narrow sort of ideas that are easy to formulate and easy to express. And there's no nuance and there's no depth and there's no fundamental weight to what is being said. It mirrors the immediate gratification process that has taken over in our societies. And I think a lot of people are starting to step back and go, no, just wait a minute. You know, I mean, parents do the best they can, but if they don't have the skills or the knowledge to work with, or the resources or the time. Yeah. I mean, we've constructed a world that takes people's time away from them. Yeah. They're expected to somehow juggle so much in a 24-hour period. And so, of course, something is going to get lost in that mix. And for, you know, people who do their best, I mean, that's why they're taking their 18-month-old to an emergency department. They don't know how to soothe this child. Mm. And they have been inculcated with this idea that there is a simplistic solution, that something could fix it. Mm. They don't know what that is, so they go searching for the answer with what they think are experts. Mm. But what they need to do, of course, is step back and understand that the answer to distress is comfort and care and love. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with an 18-month-old.
And this brings me into another sort of talking point, and that is that if we think about the sort of current, interventions, I mean, I've got a waiting list of close to 6 months to get in to see me. Now, I'm very tight that when I start working with someone, that the longest amount of time between sessions initially is 2 weeks. If there's any hint of suicidality, it's weekly, or I do the 2-week appointment, but I check in between. Now, one of the reasons why I do that is because a lot of people, by the time they come and see me, have already been prescribed an antidepressant. Now, if I'm talking about teenagers, what that means is they're given an antidepressant, and in very few instances does the prescriber necessarily explain, firstly, that it takes 4 to 6 weeks to kick in, and that you may actually experience an increase in suicidality. I was talking to a friend of mine who works, very much into the community support stuff about suicide and suicide prevention and so on. And he says it's a major problem. And part of the problem is the lack of patient education, but the other part of the problem is the supporting resources aren't there to actually really be there to carry that person through, because in some instances that suicidality seems to abate as the medication kicks in more. But in a lot of cases it doesn't.
There's a major problem with handing out antidepressants like their lollies, is that there are very well-researched reactions that people have to these medications, and one of them is agitation. Mm. And if you are feeling suicidal, or if you are very much on the edge with anxiety, to have an increase in agitation can be extraordinarily dangerous. because, it can just set off a roller coaster of emotional states that you don't have the skills to monitor and control, and no one else is monitoring that because you've been given this medication and sent home, and there's no one monitoring what's happening for you. And this is not a good plan, and it's not safe, and it is a major flaw at the moment in the way our system is supporting people.
Yeah. So, bringing this all together, if we go into 2023 and you were a benign dictator, any solutions, any processes? What do we need to do to get, certainly we're throwing money at this thing left, right and centre, but it's not getting better. The trend is upward, not downward. So, fundamentally people's level of, distress and disorders seems to be increasing. We're an industrialised country. We're in, certainly male suicide is just through the roof.
I think we need to start having a much more robust and a much more educated discussion around what it is to be human and what works for humans and what doesn't work for humans. Yeah. And we need to be looking at this from the really big picture, not just here in Sydney or here in Australia. This is a planetary issue because all humans in every country, in every continent, are struggling with the modern world. It's not user-friendly for us, the way we have designed it at all. Now, we watched that astronaut the other day.
Rob Garan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what a smart man.
Yeah.
And maybe being able to sit up there in space and look at this planet from above helped him to see it and put it into the perspective he did. But he's absolutely right. We have to think about the planet, because if there's no air to breathe, we're all going to die anyway.
Yeah.
Then we have to think about society.
Yeah.
And then we think about the basics of economy and, systems and structures.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, I can overlay that framework, in a sense, into what helps human beings to grow and mature successfully, which is firstly, the current system goes, we need to pay attention to cognitive and academic achievement. Then, we need to pay attention to the sort of physical stuff, and then we need to pay attention to the emotional stuff. It's flipped around. Alan Shaw talks about, we need to help children to develop emotionally first, then socially, and then cognitively.
That's right, because children are born into a family completely dependent on that family in every way for their survival on every level. And it's a relational process. They become human. They become themselves in their relationship to others, to their caregivers, to the wider family, then to the wider group around that family, and then moving gradually outward as they grow up. And so it starts with them learning how to be human in their attachment to their family. And that is what is the core problem for so many people.
And in order to do that, we need rest, we need time, and we need to have limited exposure to devices. Now, you know me, I was one of the first people who bought an Apple computer when it was called an Apple IIc, right? So I'm an early... getting into technology type of person, right? I uptake really quickly on technology, right? But I very quickly saw that smartphones were a problem. And it's not actually necessarily the phone itself, it's a combination between the phone and the App Store. And Dr. Mark Williams, neuroscientist, and I've been talking a lot about that. And he wrote a really interesting article on smartphones are basically making us dumber, and it's true.
Yes.
Right. So the whole
digital dementia.
Yeah. So we, in a sense, within the family dynamic, those devices need to be minimalised, and at the moment they're front and centre. We watch families in restaurants, and the kids are sitting there all on their devices rather than being able to interact with the rest of the family members. That's completely pointless. But also the parents are often on their phone. Now, there's massive evidence, through, organisations like the Max Planck Institute, that gaze aversion with 0 to 18-month 3-year-olds creates agitation.
Well, that makes sense, because all the research we have about ourselves and other primates is that the response of the child to the parent and then that reciprocal response is through the gaze. It's through locking eyes and looking at each other. Children follow their parents with their gaze. They follow their caregivers with their gaze. It's vital for that sense of self to be created, for that sense of attachment to be created. And attachment requires that you actually interact with each other.
Which
and
generates...
you can't do that with the screen between you. Yeah. So, along with all of the other research that shows about our neural pathways and how they're being triggered by the light and the movement of the screen, it's really quite significant. It's there. Our government actually has guidelines about how much time children should have on a screen, and yet people are not being given this information in a really strong and robust way, so that they are still, without realising it, creating significant issues for their children with their behaviour, the parents' behaviour, of using devices, of not being present emotionally in their caring for their children. It's something that we really need to work very hard on, because as a species we are not doing well at the moment.
And I am encouraged by the fact that a lot of the high schools are starting to eliminate smartphones in the high school environment. I think I was always very, very concerned that kids would be able to take their phones to school, and how they, then we talk about inattention or attention deficit disorder. They're distracted.
We've created it.
Yeah.
We've created this deficit in attention.
Well, you read an article on dogs, and they found that there's a gene in dogs about attention deficit which is similar to that in the human being, and the mitigating factor was the actual attachment level with the animal.
With their human, human family.
Yeah, the better embedded they are in the human family, the less symptomatic they are.
Exactly.
I thought that was a gem. That was just, this whole thing about attachment isn't just about humans. It's about any living organism that has a certain capacity to generate, relationship and culture and society. So, all right. Anything else before we finish?
I don't think so, darling. I think we've really...
we could talk hours.
We could, but do other people want to listen to us talking for hours, darling?
Yeah, I'm an optimist. I think they do. So, as the last episode for this season, I hope you found this interesting and informative, and we'll see you on the other side in 2023. This is me signing off.
Goodbye from Lorin.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.